we got a stack of Bible verses that say bad things about people of the same gender having sex. But what that is addressing are those ancient expressions of sexuality that were abusive. Our culture is so different. We actually have to do some work and some thinking. We can't just apply that to our world in a simple way.
Karl, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited and honored to be here.
I'm excited too. So you're a queer Christian pastor, but I want to start with what church did you grow up in?
Well, I grew up in the Pentecostal Church in Blacktown. If you don't know, if you don't know the area, it's Doonside, which is kind of like Western Blacktown. And it was a kind of a very, very old school church. Our pastor was a bit of a cowboy. Yeah, honestly, one of my earliest memories of church is everyone wearing those cowboy neckties where you would have like a horse on it. And I would go to church and all of the men would be dressed in black suits, but they would have that horse pendant around their neck. So yeah, quite a masculine kind of vibe. And gosh, I didn't relate to that very strongly. I always found it a little bit kind of intimidating. But so the Pentecostal movement back in the 1980s was big into positive thinking and faith healing and a lot of joy. And I always used to love going to church, absolutely love going to church, because it was bright and it was joyful and people would praise and sing. And church was meant to be exciting. You know, it wasn't a quiet worship service. We would usually have time in the service for faith healing and miracles. And, you know, as a little kid, that just seemed like a fun, exciting thing. So those were my earliest memories of church.
And how did you reconcile your sexuality with your faith?
Yeah, that is a much longer and more intricate story.
Why are we here?
Yeah. Well, my sexuality and my faith, was a very long and complex journey. Probably didn't all happen in one step. There was probably a lot of different steps along the way to that. In the 80s as well, you know, the concept of being gay was really scary. Like, it was still something that, was not reported on positively in the news. It was still seen as being criminal. Most people, you know, just the casual cultural assumption back then, even outside of the Christian church, was that gay people are somehow a little bit weird and off. Like, there's something not quite right about this. And I was talking to a colleague of mine last night who's also a queer minister, who was just saying, you know, when he came out, his family, it wasn't a big deal to his family, but it was still scary because his dad was very masculine and into sports. So the whole family was like, oh, I wonder how his dad's going to react to this. But in the church, the Pentecostal church, you know, most of the experience that you would have of church would be this bright, really positive, you know, we were all believing for healing and for success in our lives, and God was on our side and all of that stuff. But also the world, we used to talk about the world as all the people who aren't Christians. The world was a bit of a scary place. And honestly, as a kid, we didn't hear a lot about the evils of gay people. We'd hear about the evils of feminism, you know, and how women in the workplace, you know, disrupting the natural order of the family. And, you know, we always had magazines available in the church for women that taught them how to be traditional wives. I think it's still in publication. It's called Above Rubies. It's very funny now. And back in the 80s, it had knitting patterns in it. And so, you know, people in the world would drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes and do things like that. So that's the kind of, you know, the picture of homosexuality in your mind when you're totally immersed in that culture is that it's something extreme and something dangerous. So you just can't imagine that would be you. And most people who are queer, who grow up in that kind of a setting, then kind of remember something similar to me, that as you get closer to puberty, your feelings emerge and your personality emerges, and I had a personality emerging that wasn't the kind of masculine cowboy style masculinity that I had seen. So just, gender presentation is one part of that. But also if you have feelings that are of a kind of a sexual or romantic feeling that comes up when you're 13, it's all very innocent. You don't have any context or story for that. So when I had feelings like that, like if I got really shy around someone who was a boy my age, or if, I was thinking about that person a lot, I didn't think, oh, that's romance or that's sex or something like that. I just didn't know what that was. It was like this foreign alien thing. I didn't really think about the issue until I was given a book when I was a young teenager called Preparing for Adolescence, which is all about how to grow up into a nice Christian adult. And it just had like one paragraph about gay people in it. And it said, usually when people are young, they spend a lot of time worrying that they might be gay. But it's extremely rare and people almost always grow out of it. So that was then my story. It's like, oh, well, if anything comes up that I worry about, people almost always grow out of that. It's like that. Well, everyone has gay thoughts sometimes, but don't worry about that because just ignore it. That attitude.
Action, right?
So, yeah. And, because of the media presentation, because, I think by the 90s you were having Mardi Gras on the news. But most Mardi Gras floats when you're at the Mardi Gras are just brightly colored and people celebrating life and waving flags and fun. But the news would always focus on the slightly extreme ones. And then the picture you have in your mind of queer people, I had, the extreme Mardi Gras floats. And I remember Mr. Humphreys from Are You Being Served? He's like, he works in menswear and his whole sexuality is about getting excited about measuring men for their pants. So he would have his tape measure and just like absolutely get so excited when a man needed to be fitted. And then there was Police Academy. And the two bad guy cops always kind of accidentally end up running into this gay bar where there are these men dressed in leather who insist on slow dancing with them. And so that was, if you said the word gay to me, those were all the pictures that came into my mind, like not just from religion, from culture in general. So that to me, gay people were these freaks and there was just no possibility that I was anything like that. And that kind of all worked perfectly well in my mind until I was in second or third year university. And I fell in love with someone and I was totally blindsided by it because actually I'd somehow missed the information that gay people fall in love. I didn't know they did that. I thought even by third year university, I think I'd actually sat through lectures about sexuality and diversity. I just didn't know that gay people fell in love. It's not something that I was prepared for. So it just completely shocked me.
Sex on the street.
Yeah. Or, in those weird clubs that they have in Police Academy, or like Mr. Humphreys, like they find excuses to measure people the inside of their trousers and that's how they get their excitement about it. That was just the picture, and I think I had a very sheltered and conservative family life. So I think a lot of people my age had figured out, what, gay people are just gay people and they're fine and leave them alone. And they're the same as everyone else. But the combination of a religious upbringing that I had and then the way that gay people were portrayed in the media, I was just basing that on the information that I'd seen. And then this part never came from my family, but in the 1990s, there were a lot of like Pentecostal revival movements. And as a teenager, I'd often go along to stuff and listen to different new exciting movements. And there were a lot of people at that time in the Pentecostal movement who were saying that homosexuality was a demon. Like, so the idea was nobody's actually gay, but there are evil spirits that are gay and they will if anyone has gay feelings, what happens is the evil spirit is inside them, trying to act out the evil lusts of the evil spirit through this person. So if I ever had sexual thoughts when I was a teenager, I was like, oh my goodness, there's a demon in the room. Like, so I had somehow gotten my whole sexuality and just categorized it as this evil spiritual presence. And that really messed me up. I think that particular belief, every time I think about it now, I laugh because it's so ridiculous. But that particular belief at the time, I think, did more damage to me psychologically than anything else about my upbringing.
That you had a gay demon in you. What the heck? How did you sort of deconstruct that belief and realize it wasn't real or legitimate?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing that happened to me was falling in love, because that just didn't fit anywhere. What I was feeling didn't match any of the stories. Like, I think that when that happened to me, I just couldn't make sense of any of the things that I'd been told. And nothing at all made sense. And, this was 2000, like third year university. That would have been 2000 or 2001. I was still living with my parents. I was still financially dependent on my parents. And this was in the days of dial-up internet. And there's no queer literature in the library because it's too controversial at that time for there to be any information. There's just no information available about anything like that. But when my parents weren't home, I'd go and dial up internet. And I found this one website by a Catholic priest who went through faith and sexuality issues. And, back then, it was, I'm trying to remember the name of this book. The website was called Visions of Daniel because the author is named Daniel. And he just went through the Bible passages one at a time, and said, basically the information that you get is in the ancient world, people didn't know about sexual orientation. But they did know about the Greek practice of pederasty, which was a sexual expression that was quite normal in the Greek world, but we would call the abuse of a young teenager. They did have temple prostitution. They did have slavery, like male slaves were seen as the property of their owners. So when people talked about sex between people of the same gender in the ancient world, they're thinking about those things, pederasty, temple prostitution, and those are all abusive expressions. So, yeah, we've got a stack of Bible verses that say bad things about people of the same gender having sex. But what that is addressing are those ancient expressions of sexuality that were abusive. And we can't just, our culture is so different, we actually have to do some work and some thinking. We can't just apply that to our world in a simple way. And so I read this, it became a book later on. It was just a website back then. And, when my parents weren't home, I'd dial up on the internet and I'd read as many chapters as I could before my parents got home. But, it just completely blew my mind. Because we grew up, the church that I grew up in, even though I said it was very anti-feminist, we always had women preaching. We always had women pastors. There was a local church that had a woman as a senior pastor, and we always used to go and visit that church, and it was completely fine. We knew that what the Bible said about women must remain silent in church, that didn't apply to our world. We knew that what the Bible said when it said, there's another Bible verse, slaves obey your masters. We don't take that and apply that to our world because it's different, because we don't have ancient patriarchal families, because we don't have slavery anymore. Those Bible verses don't address us. And so I had the theological framework to know if there's a reason for these verses, like if they're not talking about people who are genuinely queer, they're talking about sexual violence, they're talking about treating people like property, you can't just flip that over onto us. So I guess I had that theological breakthrough, but I was also still a fundamentalist Christian. It was like this one piece had been taken out of my theology. And I'm like, oh, okay, so it's okay to be gay. But I still didn't believe in evolution. Like, I thought that the world was 6,000 years old. I still thought Jesus was coming back any day now. And I still thought, I came out as gay, and I wouldn't even touch alcohol for a few years after I was out as gay, because I thought alcohol was probably sinful. I had these really conservative beliefs. And this one thing of accepting my sexuality had just, it was like, I don't know how to describe, like, if you had this entire, you've got this whole car that's set up as a car, but you've just taken the steering wheel off and put bike handles on it. It's like I just changed that one part, and it just didn't fit. And so what I did was I was just finishing my degree, and I was planning on doing a master's degree in the research that I'd just done for my honors. And I just changed. I just went to another institution and I studied theology, because I just knew I don't even know where to start readjusting not just my theology, like my picture of the universe. I mean, I think the first year of my master's degree in theology, I just spent reading everything I could find about creation and evolution, because I couldn't get my head around that.
What you're talking about sounds intellectual, and
yeah,
you can be a theologian and not know God. When I say know God, I mean, like, my understanding of Christianity is, well, what it says in the Bible is you have the Holy Spirit indwelling within you, right? So you can go to church, study the doctrine, be a theologian and all that, but not have the Spirit dwelling within you. I'm trying to ask, what was your conviction like around homosexuality? Because I think sometimes people, they make the truth, they try and make the truth up, and they try and say, oh, well, this Bible verse is not applicable to us, or there's this verse, and it gets all sort of discombobulated. But what was your spiritual conviction like, or when did your faith start to become more spiritual rather than theological?
Well, I'll have to go back to the beginning of the story again to go through. There's a whole parallel narrative with that. Yeah. Because when I was a little kid growing up in the Pentecostal Church, religion seemed very exciting. But I think in the 1980s, a lot of people who grew up in the 1980s had a fear-based relationship with God. I'm not really sure how this happened, because I don't think my parents ever had a fear-based relationship with God. They always had a lot of comfort about that. But what our generation of kids were taught in Sunday school was the world's going to end, and it could happen tonight. And so you need to be right with God, or when this happens, you're going to, you're going to end up going through a lot of terrible things that are going to happen. And so I used to, we were told, accept Jesus into your heart and then you'll be fine. Which I did that, but I think I probably invited Jesus into my heart like hundreds and hundreds of times when I was a little kid, because you're kind of afraid that it didn't work properly. Like, oh no, maybe I didn't do it well enough, and I'll still get left behind by all of that. And a long time before I was even thinking about coming out, I would have been around 15 or 16 years old. Those revival movements that I was talking about, the Toronto Blessing and the Brownsville Revival, all those different things, people would come and do these tours of different cities, and impart the presence of God to people. And these were, not theologically sophisticated people, but they were spiritually really, really powerful. And I encountered the Holy Spirit in a lot of those meetings. And it was quite overwhelming for me. And I had a transformation. I want to say this is when I was 16, where I'd known God in one way, like I'd known God probably in a religious sense, and I'd known God as someone who you could get in a lot of trouble with. And also, as this kind of Santa Claus, like, because you can get healed and you can have success in your life and all that kind of stuff. But some of those meetings when I was a teenager, we would just spend hours weeping. We would just spend hours laughing. Like there was if someone hasn't experienced this, I'll never be able to describe it to them. But there were some meetings where you could walk into and everyone was just laughing, this spiritual laughter. And I would spend a solid hour laughing. I have no idea what we were laughing about, but like I remember there being so much pain in my sides from the laughter being so intense. And it was, people, that's really weird. That's kind of like a ecstatic experience or something. But the God that I encountered in those meetings was playful. It was like the God that I encountered was making us laugh and saying, you need to stop taking all of this so seriously. And so those experiences changed my life. And a few years later, when I actually did fall in love with someone, and I recognized that energy of love as being the nature of God, that was what changed everything. Because what I was experiencing in my sexuality was not against God. It was the same kind of spiritual energy. And we say one thing, a teaching of the Christian religion, is that you can recognize God through the fruits of love, joy, and peace. And I think, to me, that's probably the most important theological principle that I know is, well, at a certain point in my life, what I'd been taught no longer connected to love and joy and peace. But I was recognizing that who God had created me to be was a source of love, joy, and peace. And that's how you recognize who and where God is and what God is doing is through those spiritual forces. And I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, you've made me think of, well, I do think of the vice list and the sins, right? Quote unquote sin.
Yeah.
And what you're saying makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, about the, what it says about same-sex relations in the Bible, they're often violent. And I can understand that today as wrong, right? We understand violence is wrong, whether people do it or not, like, greed, gluttony, all these other things, you don't even have to be a Christian to understand it's wrong, right? But yeah, loving same-sex relations, yeah, it's confusing because I've never felt personally convicted either, but then I'm worried we can't base our faith off our feelings, right? Like there's got to be something that we're adhering to, and this is, or that's something that's guiding us. And this is where I look to the Bible, but I still struggle. I don't know. I still struggle with those verses. I was reading Romans yesterday, and God gave them over to their unnatural desires for each other. Men were doing shameful things with men. Women were doing unnatural things with each other. Is that sort of the same thing you were talking about? That it was violence. It wasn't a loving same-sex act.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a lot of time in that Romans chapter 1 that you were describing about. I actually remember, I think, so when I fell in love, I knew that something didn't make sense and something needed to change because the nature of God didn't agree with the teaching. And I think it's probably the teaching that is a problem then. But that was a heart-based thing, and I needed to reconcile that with my head. And I do remember just having Romans open and getting, my dad's a pastor. He had all these reference books, and I got all these concordances and dictionaries out, and I'm looking up these words. And so what that website that I went to, Visions of Daniel, had said was that Rome was an honor and shame culture. And they believed that the most honorable kind of sexuality was to have a household that looked like the empire, where you have a strong man as the leader. And then that leader has a wife, and the children are like the citizens. The man is in charge, and it's honorable for the man to have sex with his wife because that shows power going from the leader down. But in Rome, like Rome was seen by the time of Paul as being this decadent society where everyone was having these orgies. And at the orgies, you'd often you'd overeat, you'd have these massive banquets. People would binge and purge, and they would bring in prostitutes, male and female prostitutes. And so there's this criticism of the decadence of Roman society. And Paul says, yeah, men are doing things that are dishonorable. And I think the King James Bible that I grew up on said vile. And a lot of our modern translations say shameful. And I looked up the Greek word, which was atimia, which means dishonor. And I looked at other references to atimia in the Bible. And one of the primary ways that word is used is that Jesus experienced dishonor and disgrace on the cross. So we read that and we say, oh, shameful. That means, shameful means sinful. Like, it's so shameful that this person lied. It's so shameful that but the way that that word is used is usually more like something really socially unacceptable and culturally disgusting has happened. So Roman society had become so decadent that they were behaving in a way that was shameful at these orgies. Paul isn't actually saying at that point that a sin happened. He's saying that because when you read through the chapter, because they worship idols, because they reject the one God and worship idols, God then hands them over to shame, such as the Roman orgies. Like God has kind of said, okay, if you're walking away from me, I'll let you go. Like, I'm not throwing you out, but if you want to go, you can go. And what they've ended up with are these indulgent, decadent orgies. And the Roman society is really falling apart because Rome wasn't productive anymore. Rome wasn't producing great military leaders anymore. But it's this criticism of Roman culture. And there's no word in that particular passage about same-sex relationships between the men. There's no word that means sin. All of the words are connected to dishonor and shame and public disgrace. And then at the end of the chapter, it says further, God has handed them over to all kinds of, and there's a vice list at the end, which lists things like gluttony and gossip and backbiting and lists of actual sins. But all of that flows from Paul's point in Romans chapter 1 is that they've abandoned God. They've turned away from God. And the first thing that happened was their culture became decadent and shameful. And now you can see the fruit of all this sinful behavior in it. And he does use the Roman orgy, and he uses some of the expressions of, like, especially in Rome, master and slave sex was very common. So that's probably one of the things that's in view. There were possibly mystery cults in Rome that were practicing temple prostitution. So that could be another thing that's in view. And I think Paul's point that he makes in Romans 1 is really good. Like, actually, do you know what? This decadent culture, where you seem to be going after pleasure but not caring about other people, and not caring about God's will for your life, that's destructive. Yeah, I think Romans 1 is absolutely on the money, but I just don't think that what Paul is talking about is some kid who's growing up in our modern society and finds out that she's attracted to girls. I don't think that's what that's what he's worried about.
Okay, so same-sex relations are okay, just no decadent orgies. Got it. What do you have to say to this? I mean, there's an ex-gay movement, but there are a lot of I met these theologians the other day. They were like, yeah, we have same-sex feelings, but we don't act on them, and now we're happily married to men. Like, what's your response? Well, I mean, my theory is they're just bisexual, but what do you have to say about that movement?
Yeah, well, one thing that I would say is it's very new. So in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, there was a big ex-gay movement. And that sounded at the time just like what you're saying. There were so many people confident. I mean, if you've seen the Netflix documentary Pray Away, Cy Rogers and all these different folks, they were so confident in saying that they'd fixed it. And the theory then was that, you know, if you're gay, it's because you weren't close to your same-sex parent. And so you're now trying to get the affection that you missed in childhood, but you're just confused. You want it in the form of sex, and you just, once you fix that childhood wound, you'll be fine. And all of them have come out. This documentary is incredible, and it was powerful for me to watch it because they all said, you know what, not only did we were desperate and we were saying something that didn't make sense to us either, but also when we really confidently said that we'd been fixed and it wasn't a problem for us anymore, we were lying. And I kind of understand that because I remember like being a teenager and not having a solution to this problem. It's very easy to lie to yourself and say, oh my goodness, yeah, I prayed for an hour and, you know, I haven't had a sexual thought since then. And, you know, it's been almost a day. So I'm probably not gay anymore. It's probably fine. And it's very easy to trick yourself because you're so desperate for a solution. It's in the last 10 years, we've known for 50 years that ex-gay therapy doesn't work, but you always get a few maverick psychologists saying, no, we can fix it. And now everyone has agreed it doesn't work. The movement just rebranded and said, oh no, what's happening now is that we accept ourselves as being gay. We'll always be gay, but we can meet our needs for human connection through friendship, and be celibate and not act on it. And, you know, there's a new generation of people who are giving testimonies and saying, yeah, I'm doing this and it's working fine. But if we learn the lesson of history, the folks in the 80s who did something very similar ended up as train wrecks. You know, some of them ended up being caught in scandal, being caught hooking up in a gay bar when they were giving testimonies still. Others said, you know what, I got through all of that and I ended up with psychological problems. I ended up with addictions and eating disorders. And I mean, in the ex-gay community, all of these psychological problems were so huge. Not to mention, one of the health concerns about the ex-gay movement was so many ex-gays had undiagnosed sexually transmitted diseases, because part of the ex-gay movement was, you know, everyone sins sometimes and you get forgiven. So you'll be ex-gay for a month and then you'll sin and you'll run out and then you'll come back and you'll be forgiven and you'll pray about it. All you're thinking about is your spiritual life and how you've betrayed God and how you need to pray. And you don't notice the fact that you've contracted HIV, and every time you have a little spiritual crisis, you run out and infect more people. So the ex-gay movement was a huge health problem, but we didn't see any of that reported on in the 80s and 90s. It's only when you hear people's testimonies now, all these decades later, that you understand the harm that was done. And this new celibate movement, I think, okay, we don't know what's happening behind the scenes. We don't know how many of these people are being manipulated. Now, I know that a lot of the folks who really publish well in this new kind of celibacy movement have really powerful and wealthy Christian leaders kind of behind them who are bankrolling this new ministry because they think it's so important. But there's an enticement of fame and wealth that goes with that, of getting your name on a book, of feeling like you're part of a really important movement, that you have these Christian leaders who want you to say this message. And I think a lot of the really powerful Christian leaders in the world would be embarrassed to talk about gay people have to be celibate. I've got my wife and I'm good, but gay people have to be celibate. So what they do is they find queer people who'll give the celibacy line, and they give them a platform, and they give them all the attention, and they get to say the anti-gay message. And then it kind of gets through, because you don't want to be mean to this poor celibate gay person. We haven't seen the outcome of the celibacy movement. It's coming.
Okay. I mean, what I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks is that just another way people are using their, we say the flesh, right? To get a sense of righteousness. Like, look at me, I am denying this version of myself to be holy. But to me, that's opposite of the gospel. That's you trying to say, I am abstaining. I am being moral. And it's just like you fall into this other. A lot of these people, like you just said, right? They end up, having, doing the opposite of what they're promoting. 100%.
Yeah. And that was the thing that when I came out, when I was in my early 20s and I came out, you would talk about grace. You would talk about our relationship with God as a gift. We don't, there's a hymn that is very famous that says, nothing in my hand I bring, right? That's our relationship with God. We come to God and we receive everything that we need from God. And it's a beautiful experience. And then people say to gay people, you should just come to God and receive, this gift from him. And part of that gift is going to be heterosexuality or the gift of celibacy or all this stuff. And yet, because people have a sexual orientation, that becomes a life of endless grinding. And it means committing to probably lacking human connection for most of your life. It means every day looking in the mirror and seeing something that is fundamentally broken there instead of something that is a beautiful creation of God. It's that life is one of the most shocking examples of, in traditional Christian theology, we talk about the flesh. That is a human effort to be good enough for God, like using our flesh, like think of it maybe as muscle, right? We're going to muscle our way into God's favor. And that's, whether you spin this as ex-gay or whether you spin this as celibacy, in practice, it looks exactly the same for queer people when they try and live their lives. They're doing exactly the same thing, and it takes exactly the same toll on people psychologically. And it's not sustainable because you carry that load and eventually you fall flat on your face.
Well, that's what I meant before. Human effort to say, I am. Yeah. Christianity is not a spirituality of abstaining from doing stuff, right? It's supernaturally being changed by the Spirit of God. Why the heck is everyone so obsessed with this then? With sex in general?
Oh, wow.
Here we go.
I could go right back to early Christianity. The first really sex-negative theologian was Augustine in the 5th century. Unfortunately, the man had some problems of his own, and admitted as much. In his Confessions, he talks about some of his fairly messed up feelings that he had. And he taught a doctrine that said that the spirit is pure, but it's corrupted by the flesh. And he took flesh differently. So we use the word flesh when we're talking about it then in the ancient Hebrew sense of human effort. But for Augustine, flesh meant body. So our bodies are the corrupting influence, and it's through our body. He believed that all sin affected the human spirit through the body. So maybe there's a delicious smell and that promotes gluttony, or maybe someone is really cute and that promotes lust, or, it's all the body's fault working its way against the spirit. And that's the opposite of everything the Bible says, because the fundamental teaching in chapter 1 of the Bible is God created the world, the material world, and said it is good, it is good, it is good. And when it was finished, God said it is very good. And you can't get a more unambiguous positive report on bodies and the material world than that. Not to mention the fact that Jesus himself could see no better way of repairing God's relationship with humankind than taking on flesh himself. He wanted to take on flesh. And by doing that, he said, this flesh is so good, this material physical world, that I'm actually going to make it part of who I am. That's how good the body is. That's how good the world around us is. So Augustine said that sex was bad, said that even married couples can have sex if they want to have kids, but they'd be better off skipping it. Like his attitude towards marital sex was you can do it if you have to, but it probably would be better not to. And then, you know, in the 20th century, so much of our history was about finding different groups to hate. When we started to have global power, you know, people were, a friend of mine, Kathy Baldock, wrote an incredible book, Walking the Bridgeless Canyon, where she ties all of this in, the theology to the politics. And in the 1950s, there was this scare about communists. And one of the lines that the US came up with as a kind of a psychological scare tactic was that the communists are trying to make your kids gay. The communists will recruit. That's why we have homosexuals. In the 1980s, the Republicans couldn't win without the Christian vote. And the Republicans had never been a Christian party before. But they suddenly said, what were some of the scare tactics? They said, gay people want to teach in schools. And so we need to make sure that gay people are not allowed to teach in our schools, because that will, if you have a gay teacher, your kid's probably going to end up gay. So they started promising laws against gay people, laws against abortion. They promised all of that to the right-wing Christians, and the right-wing Christians all kind of signed up to the Republican Party. But in order to get that alliance, they needed the scare tactic of essentially was gays and abortions and guns became the three big issues. And it was, I mean, because that was like just as I was born was when that whole compromise kind of happened. I read that and I'm like, oh my goodness, they didn't, before the 1980s, no one was scared about gay people might be teaching our kids. Like that was a line that some think tank invented because they wanted to win an election. But I don't think Christianity, even today, they don't notice that they've been sold this deal, that their connection to the Republican Party in the USA has kept a certain group of people in power. And what it's meant is that now Christianity is tied to this political movement. And as it gets really ugly, and like the Republican Party is, I don't know if the Republican Party is going to survive a couple more elections. It's becoming so weird. But the Christian faith is kind of sinking in the same ship. I think we really have to think about divesting from this movement that's not served us.
Yeah, it sounds like Christianity kind of needs to be revived in a way. I mean, yeah. My last question was, what is the modern day church getting wrong about God? I know we've talked about like homosexuality and sex, but what do you think the main thing is there?
I said this in a sermon the other day, and I try and avoid the word heresy, but I think sometimes when you look at church history, there are really obvious ways that we look back and the church has just gotten something terribly wrong, and we often call that a heresy. And I think what the church is doing today, that if I was looking back as a historian, I would be like, oh my goodness, this one thing is churches constantly are looking for something other than faith in Jesus that will define you as a Christian. And right now there's this whole massive thing about affirming traditional marriage. It's like someone comes to Jesus and says, what do I have to do to be saved? And Jesus says, follow me love God and love your neighbor, and we're headed towards Jerusalem where I'm going to die. And you go. And that's what it means to be a Christian. It means to be a follower of Jesus. And I don't know, even if the traditional marriage thing is right, what the church is saying today is, what do you need to do to be saved? Follow Jesus, affirm that marriage is between one man and a woman, and that man and woman means what someone is identified as on their birth certificate, and then love your neighbor as yourself and come to church. And this whole political fight has gotten loaded into the definition of a Christian. And it's, I think I can't find a definition of heresy that doesn't describe that. That is blasphemy, and it's antichrist. Like, I'm going to use all the words. You can't add something. If a relationship with God is a gift, you can't add your latest political struggle into that and require people to believe that as well. If it's a gift, then it's a gift.
What do we do about it? Because people are just, I mean, people ask me, why are you Christian? Like, it's so...
Yeah.
It's so hard. It is. It's hard having to explain yourself like all the time. I'm gay, and having people to look at you just, she'll come right eventually. But I'm just like, man, you should see all the work God's doing in my heart. Like, it's phenomenal. But all you can see me as is gay, and it's. What do you do about it?
I used to get frustrated about that too. I think one way that I've adjusted my mentality about that issue is, and I used to hear this preached in the 80s in fundamentalist Pentecostal churches, that somebody else's spiritual journey is what God is doing in their life. You can't do anything about it. Like, even when you preach the gospel to people, like, even if you're given a platform and asked to preach Jesus to people, they won't say yes unless they're ready. So if people say to me, why are you a Christian? I just say, well, it's a bunch of stuff that happened to me. I don't expect you to. If you haven't experienced this, you can't fake that. I don't think that I can say anything that will convince you to be a believer. When I encountered God as a teenager, and I honestly, as a kid, was trying to force myself to believe in God because I didn't want to get left behind when Jesus came back. But as a teenager, when I actually just encountered God as, the same way that I'm encountering you right now, even though we're not in the same room, I'm seeing you there. And I just know that I'm encountering another human being because we're having a conversation. When I encountered God like that, I just couldn't deny God's presence. That, for the rest of my life, was going to be my spiritual path. And when 5 years later, I came out and I expected God to reject me. And I woke up the next day and I was like, what are you still doing here? Like, I'm trying to get on with my business. I'm assuming that now that I have said I'm gay, which I say queer now, but at the time I used to say gay a lot. I thought that when I said that, you would leave, and I was expecting you to be gone. But you won't leave me alone. You're still here. I'm going about my business, and it's like you're following me. And to me, that when I say our relationship with God is a gift, like, I wasn't even asking for a relationship with God anymore. Like, I wasn't even giving my willingness. I wasn't even giving my expectation. I wasn't seeking anything. God was just there waiting. And I said, well, if this is such a pure gift that even throwing it back in your face doesn't cancel the gift, then I'm just going to have to find out how to deal with the, Bible verses. In the face of an experience like that, who cares about Bible verses? I'm totally forgotten what question you asked. I don't know what what do I say to people?
Fine.
Yeah.
What do you say? What do you say to, yeah. I mean, you're older, right?
I would just say, look, I've had this experience, but you might not have had an experience like that. So you have to believe what you believe. I'm not going to pressure you, But if you ever do encounter something more, or if you ever want something more, I'm happy to share what I've experienced with you. But, you know, I mean, I remember being a teenager and having conversation with friends, and I was like, oh, no, I'm not being left behind in the rapture because I'm a Christian, but you might get left behind. You have to do it as well. And you have these little debates with people. And I just think that that's the most pointless waste of time, because you encounter God or you don't encounter God. An argument doesn't change anything.
Hey, oh man, I've got so many. Yeah, I didn't even get through most of my questions, so I'm going to have you back on the show. But where can people find you or your work?
So Crave Church is in the Sydney CBD. We meet 4:00 on Sundays in St. Stephen's Uniting Church. It's right near Martin Place Station and across the road from New South Wales Parliament. So it's so easy to find. Big green door, find us. Our website is cravemcc.com. We are currently trying to fix the website, but all the correct information is there and it's all still valid. Crave Church is easy to find on Facebook. You can follow us on Facebook, and I'm posting a couple of times a week about what's going on in the life of church. So it's pretty easy to find if you have a bit of a search around online. And it's a very loving, accepting community of people who are very diverse and very real. You won't kind of get any fake, weird Christianity, just people who are struggling through life and are keen to see where you're at and what you're going through as well. That's how to find me.
Crave Church. All right. Thank you so much, Karl Hand. It's been really enlightening, and I'll have to get you back on the show.
Awesome. Yeah. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.